Hi, Leah here at my sewing room. I'm going to show you guys some of the basics of using Bernina B325. This is similar to other machines in the 300 series, as well as lots of the older machines for threading. So I'm going to show you guys what you're looking at when you pull the bobbin out of the bobbin case and how to get this all back together properly. So you can lift the latch on the bobbin case to pull it out towards you. And then your bobbins come straight out. They fit onto your bobbin winder either way, and your bobbin winding is done following the same pathway as many other Bernina machines. So to wind a bobbin on this machine, if your thread is cross wound, it can go on the horizontal spool pin. If it's stack wound, it will be happier on the vertical spool pin with the spool felt underneath it. That would also be the place to put your decorative threads like metallic threads. Find a spool cap that will hold your thread tight. Whoops, bump that. And then we're going to cut the thread here and wind ourselves a little bobbin. So behind the rear thread guide, around the tensioner, and then you can wrap the thread around the bobbin following the arrow on the machine. If it's slippery, you might need to wrap it around 8 or 9 times. If it's pretty textured thread, it should wrap 3 or 4 times should be enough to hold it. No need to stick the thread through the holes on your bobbin. And then last of all, you're cutting the thread at the back of the bobbin winder and turning the bobbin winder on. Oh, needed a couple more wraps on that to get it started. If you only need a little bit of thread, you are able to turn off the bobbin winder whenever you want. You lift the bobbin off, and I use that thread cutter yet again to get my bobbin ready to go. I'm going to go back and use that white thread that I had on the bobbin already, just because there's lots there, and then I can teach all sorts of things. So to get our bobbin in our bobbin case, when you're looking at your bobbin case, the little arm is going to be pointed up. And then our tail on our thread should be hanging off kind of like a Q when you're looking at the bobbin. It'll set down into the bobbin case, and you'll guide the thread through the slot in the side and up and under the tension spring. When you pull on the thread after it's threaded all the way, your bobbin will be turning clockwise. This bobbin is inserted correctly for normal tension. In some instances, you may want extra tension on your bobbin case. You have a small little hole through the pigtail here, which you can thread your thread through to give yourself extra tension. You might do this for something like a decorative stitch or a satin stitch. We'll talk about those in another video. That would give you extra tension. The other parts of your machine that you need to be aware of down below is the bobbin case and the hook area. This is where your bobbin case will sit into. If you're just ready to sew right now, you can stick your bobbin case back in. The latch, the finger on the bobbin case will be pointed upward into a small groove underneath. And a firm push will seat your bobbin onto the spindle of the hook. And you can cut the thread at the bobbin case, at the door. And that's the right length to start sewing underneath. The other thing you might need to be aware of while you're looking at this area is what might need to happen if you get jammed or tangled, or if it's time to clean and oil your machine. There's a small latch on the left-hand side of the hook race area. You can press that and the flap will lay down, and then you'll be able to pull your hook out. This is called a CVCB hook. Stands for counterbalance. These have been around a long time. They sew great through just about any fabric. They're lovely. Things you need to be aware of, though, is sewing machines make lint, and sewing machines don't like lint. In here, this needs to be kept well cleaned and lint-free as best as you can. Your machine comes with a lint brush, and this should be brushed and cleaned every 2 to 3 bobbin changes or every hour of sewing time. If you leave the lint in there long, without cleaning, your machine will run noisier, and you're much more likely to run into stitching issues. And in the long run, you can cause damage to the hook on your machine. This is also where you need to make sure you're oiling your machine. Your machine comes with oil. Comes in a little tiny tube. Like so. On this machine, on a CB hook, the only place you need to oil at home is the very outer edge of the hook once you've cleaned the hook and the bobbin area. Small drop there every hour sewing time will keep your machine running along quite happily. When you're getting ready to return your hook to your machine, if you've turned the hand wheel at all, you'll want to ensure that the hook driver is to one side, and then you're going to hold the hook with the center post, and it sits down across from the hook driver to complete the circle in your stitching area, or in your hook area. Then you can close and latch the door. It's quite a firm push on most of these machines to get that to latch properly. And that's back in. If your hook is not latched in properly, the first stitch you take, it will probably pop right back out. And then you can put your bobbin case in, and you're ready, at least down below, to sew. And cut the thread. When you're threading the top of the machine, it's important to make sure that the presser foot is up, and you can do that using the presser foot lift on the back of the machine. That opens up the tension unit on the top to ensure that the thread will pass into the tension unit properly. Once again, you're going behind the rear thread guide and coming down the front of the machine. This mechanical tension unit has two sides. I think of it like a sandwich where there's bread on either side with a big slice of meat down the middle. You can either put your thread to the left or the right of that center disc. And if you're using something like a twin needle, you'll probably actually need to use both sides. And then down the bottom, all the way up to the top and back down. On here, you'll need to make sure that the needle is all the way up for your needle threader to work. The easiest way to do that is to have it programmed to stop in the up position, which you can change the programming here. So arrow pointed up. And then do one stitch with your foot pedal with the machine unthreaded. We're going behind the thread guide at the top of the needle, and that's in from the left. And then to use the needle threader, you can pull down on the gray arm part way, tuck the thread under the gray post, and then a firm push down with your left hand will lower the threader the rest of the way and push the hook through the eye of the needle. On this machine, you'll want to gently hold the thread with your right hand as it's guided through that guideway over there. And then let go gently with both hands to pull that loop of thread up to the top with the threader. And that is threaded and ready to sew. The interface on this Bernina is quite a bit different than the interface on many of the other newer models. There's no fancy touch screen display on here, so you'll just have to make friends with how this machine is set up. Couple things right off the bat. Looking at the front of the machine, your reverse button is the J-shaped reverse down at the bottom here. You do have a stop-start button. I prefer to sew with my foot pedal, but that stop-start button is great for things like buttonholes. There's speed control. So the first day you're learning to sew, I would probably have my speed way down slow, or the day you're trying to put a sleeve into a shirt. The day you're making long curtains, you can turn that speed all the way up. As I mentioned earlier while we were threading, you have the option to program where your needle stop position is. So on this machine, tapping that button will tell the machine to either stop with the needle all the way down, so the arrow pointed down on screen, or all the way up. Depending what you're doing, one might work better for you over the other. Our pattern end function, we'll talk about that when we get into pattern stitching. And then the stitch selected on screen, you can see the number highlighted right center screen. In each stitch, you're able to change the length and the width of the stitch. Your stitch width control is the top pair of buttons in the center. You can increase your stitch width, and it will show up on this top bar graph. The stitch width on the 3 series machines goes from 0 to 5.5 millimeters. I'm in a straight stitch, so I'm going to leave that down at 0. Our center set of options are the needle position buttons. So the default needle position in stitch 1 is centered, which shows up kind of right below the 3. So the line of dots here will show where the needle's landing in the stitch plate. You can move all the way to the left and all the way to the right. You might do this for something like putting in a zipper or adjusting a default seam allowance. The last pair of options are your stitch length. The default stitch length is flashing at roughly 2.5. On this straight stitch, we can decrease it from there, as shown on this bar graph here, or increase it all the way up to 5 stitches. 5 millimeters per stitch. Pretty easy. The rest of your default stitches are found in your numbers 1 through 9. These are the stitches that a general sewer will use the very most. We have a straight stitch, a zigzag, an overcasting stitch, a 3-step zigzag. Number 5 is a fancy little thing. We'll talk about that later. Number 6 is a stretch stitch or a triple stitch. Number 7 is a blind hem. Number 8, another decorative utility stitch. Number 9 is a super stretch stitch. And that number 10 or 0 is your buttonhole stitch. All you have to do to select a new stitch from these 1 to 9 is just press the number. And the number of the stitch will show up on screen, and the default width and length will show up as well. If you want to select a number higher than 10, your machine might come with a stitch card that looks like this, or the numbers will be available in your user manual. So you're able to go in and use the number key followed by a 2-digit number to type in any other stitch. So if you want to stitch out this star stitch, you would type number 30, and that will get you into the star stitch here. Firstly, I'm just going to start in straight stitch. Move my needle back to center position. We can lower the foot using the presser foot lift at the back, and then toes down to sew. If you need to reverse, you can press and hold the reverse while you're stitching. Right now the needle's programmed to stop in the up position when I stop stitching. Nice and tidy. The number 5 stitch behaves a little bit differently. So the number 5 stitch is also a straight stitch with the same default stitch length, but it has a programmed back stitch at the beginning and the end. To get started, you'll start sewing. So you'll stitch 5 stitches forward, 5 stitches backwards, and then continue on down your seam line. When you get to the end, you're going to tap the reverse to tell it that you're done with the seam. It will do 5 stitches backwards, 5 stitches forwards, and finish sewing for you. This is a great option for garment sewers who are using a 5/8 seam allowance, as your back stitch and securing stitches will be the same every time. The other thing you might want to try is using some of the temporary memory on this machine and altering a stitch to be a different type of knot. One option you have that we use here in store is using our number 2 stitch, but setting it to have 0 width and 0 length. This will allow us to go into the stitch and use it as a knot in place. A knot in place is a great option if you're doing decorative stitching and you need to secure the stitch, but you don't want a big long reverse. So we're going to start in stitch 2, which has had all its settings changed down to 0 width and 0 length. We're going to take 3 or 4 stitches in place. And then move to stitch 1, which is our regular straight stitch, and sew our seam. At the end, when we're ready, we're going to swap back to stitch 2 and few stitches right in place again to secure the seam. One more way of securing without a traditional quilter securing knot.